Graham is Jane Van Beelen, the Executive Director, Regulatory Affairs of Telstra. Then there is Richard Freudenstein, who is the CEO of Foxtel. And then David Buckingham is next with the red tie. He's the Chief Executive Officer of iiNet Limited, one of the largest ISPs in the country. Next is Brett Cottle, who is the Chief Executive Officer of APRA, which is one of the rights-owning representative organisations. And finally, I have Alan Kirkland, who is the CEO of the consumer advocacy group Choice. Well, I want to thank all of our guests, both on the stage and across the various industry sectors, for attending this evening. There's a very broad range of interest in this issue, from the content industry to the ISPs, online intermediaries, and of course to consumers right around the country. I want to thank all of those members of the public who've responded to our request via social media to be part of the discussion, and we've taken their questions, and I thank them for the time they put into sending them. We've taken their questions into account in framing this discussion. Now, what I'd like to do first, and we'll just go to the first slide, is frame the issue. So where are we today? Copyright infringement has been a long-running issue. It's been around for a very long time, and we don't imagine that we're going to be able to eliminate it completely. But while digital innovation and the internet has made it possible for vastly more copyrightable material, movies, music, everything, to be distributed, it's also opened up endless possibilities for that content to be pinched and not paid for. Now, there has been international recognition that reducing online copyright infringement requires a shared understanding of the issues, and a series of countries, and we'll talk about some of them tonight, have been grappling with the issue. What is the best means of reducing copyright infringement? Now, we've seen some very interesting trends, and I just point to the panel on the right-hand side of that slide from your perspective. One of the most common forms of copyright infringement, of audiovisual and music content, is through peer-to-peer file sharing, through BitTorrent. In 2008, BitTorrent traffic in the United States was 31% of prime-time downstream internet traffic. In 2014, it was down to less than 6%. In Asia, including Australia, it's still nearly 26%. Netflix would argue that this is because they have been able to make, they and their competitors have been able to make so much content available in a convenient manner and at an affordable price. And we'll talk later to Spotify and, of course, to Brett about the impact of the relationship between availability and affordability of content and the incidence of piracy. But right at the start, I want to ask Peter Duncan to talk to us about the importance of copyright. And Peter, as I said, he's not a movie mogul, he's not a billionaire, he's not Rupert Murdoch or even Graham Burke. He is a writer, a director, a producer. His first movie was Children of the Revolution, and as I said earlier, he's most famous today for his amazing series, Rake. So Peter, tell me, why would even Cleaver Green's heart melt and cause him to stop copyright infringement? Why is it so important that copyright be protected?
I do question the premise of the question that Cleaver would stop at anything. But having said that, the issue for me comes down to the fact that I don't think people understand the nature of the business. I don't think people understand what we do, how we do it, the labour that is put into making film and television. The Toronto Film Festival, which is on at the moment, and I've been there a few times, and they do this at most film festivals now, before a film is screened there, they show something about piracy. And everyone in the audience just goes, "Arr!" And it's a sign that people don't take it seriously. Now, part of what I'd say is that, we need to, we almost lost the war when someone called it piracy. because images of Johnny Depp and Keira Knightley and Jeffrey Rush doing wonderful things come to mind. We should call it theft, which is what it is, and then subcategorise it. But sorry, Mark, I'm getting back directly to your question. There's a film won the Oscar, but it was an indie film, Hurt Locker. In America, 6 million tickets sold, 10 million illegal downloads. Now, even Catherine Bigelow then has a problem saying for her next film, if it's an indie film, to her investors, well, I couldn't get all your money back because of this. Therefore, we have an issue in terms of people wanting to invest in independent film. In terms of that, when you're trying to make a film, you have to knit money together from all around the world. Spain used to represent 8% of the budget of an independent film. It now represents 0 because of piracy. The prevalence of piracy in Spain is such that no one will actually give you a pre-sale in Spain because your film is going to go online before you've even released it. Now that's not about my hip pocket, it's not about my bank balance, although I wish we were talking about that all night. It's about the prospect for the future of the industry. It's about the capacity for us to share our movies, our ideas, our thoughts in the future are diminishing because people are much more reluctant to invest in what we do because of piracy. And so as a filmmaker, I'm more worried about the future than I'm worried about the present, and more legally sage minds than myself will discuss the detail this evening. But if we don't do something about it, the capacity for us, particularly in Australia, to express our ideas in terms of independent film and to a lesser extent television will continue to diminish.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Can we just go to the... Yeah. I think that's a characteristic. Cleaver would have been proud of that. Would have moved any jury. Can we just go to the second slide, please? Just to talk about the Australian environment here in this context. Now, use of peer-to-peer applications remain very, very high, as you can see. And peer-to-peer, I hope everyone understands this. What we're talking about are file-sharing applications, BitTorrent being the classic one, where people, a whole swarm of people have computers, have got content, infringing content, which they can then share and upload and download and distribute very, very rapidly, and of course without paying the owners of that, the creators of that content. Now, the peer-to-peer file sharing is very high in Australia, and you can see 11.6% of the illegal downloads of Game of Thrones globally for season 4 this year occurred in Australia. Now, my friend Graham Burke comes from Melbourne, and there was a time, Graham, when Sydney outranked Melbourne in terms of copyright infringement. I always used to think that was the convict stain, but now Melbourne has overtaken us, so you can see how tempting this is. Australians obviously do have a preparedness to pay for content. It is remarkable. We've got, of all Australians with at least one media or rental subscription, 49% using Foxtel, which is Richard's company, but 27% are using Netflix, which it's estimated that is well over 200,000. But of course, Netflix isn't even available in Australia, and you have to be able to use a VPN or some other similar technique to get access to it. Obviously, ISPs are now providing their own content services over the top. Telstra with its T-Box and Optus iiNet are bundling Fetch TV. Now, the government wants to support the development of innovative paid content delivery methods and services. We want the industry to grow locally, but this cannot happen parallel to thriving illegitimate access channels for precisely the reasons Peter described. So we all understand that what the challenge is here, I think. The people that create content are entitled to be paid for it, just like any anybody else who produces any piece of work, they're entitled to be rewarded for it. The question is, and the difficult question is, what is to be done about it? What are the best ways of tackling this? Now, I just go now to the third slide. And this is an interesting question about the relationship of access, availability, and pricing. A common argument put forward by many people is the need for improved content access and availability. And you can see there the delayed release dates of the Lego Movie, which of course was substantially made in Australia, released earlier in the United States, whether it was cinema or whether it was on iTunes. And of course you can see it was more expensive in Australia than it was in the United States. Similar observations about Game of Thrones, similar observations about Sia's album, A Thousand Forms of Fear. So the argument goes, and this is not one we canvassed in the discussion paper, that one of the causes, it's not a justification, as Jane Van Beelen, your CEO David Thodey said, it's not a justification by any means, but one of the factors to take into account is the availability of content. In an internet world, is it possible any longer to have differential pricing between markets and not get a reaction of people seeking to using the opportunity to obtain content illegally? And of course, is it possible any longer to have delays in the release of a product? I mean, can you any longer release a movie or a television show in the United States and then, wait days or weeks, or indeed, as we used in the pre-internet era, months and months before it was available in Australia? So the question then is, I guess, in this context, what can rights holders do to make their content more available, more affordable, in a manner that will reduce copyright infringement? Or is that just a pipe dream? Is the fact, are people still going to want to steal content regardless of how cheap it is or how available it is? So Graham Burke, nobody has been more eloquent and consistent in their advocacy on this cause than you. You've got an enormous stake in the film industry. To what extent do you think the industry is seeking to improve the availability and prices for Australian consumers, and it doesn't really matter? Is that going to make a difference?
Well, thank you, Malcolm. Absolutely. If we're going to defeat piracy, it has to be by three initiatives. One, education, and the Koreans led the way there with the most marvellous campaign of, if you love movies, be a good downloader. Secondly, pricing and availability, which is critical. And the really good news about pricing is that much of what is known is what was, not what now is. And in recent times, there have been dramatic moves to bring down the cost of digital download. The single biggest sector in the digital download space is download for rental. It's about 79% of the digital business. And in that area, Australia is now 7% cheaper than the UK and 7% more expensive than the US, which is a major change from the way it used to be. In high def, which is increasingly popular, Australia is actually cheaper than either the US or the UK. As Village Roadshow, obviously, Malcolm, we can't tell other companies what to do. We can only, as a major player, hopefully lead by example. We're currently looking at all our pricing to investigate bringing it down even further. And also, as it gets more scale, that will be an automatic thing as well. And we're doing it for three reasons. Three rights, I call it to my people. It's right because it's good for our customers. It's right because it will help the war on piracy. But also for my shareholders, it's right because we're going to create a whole new business model of volume, make it cheap, make it affordable, and people will buy it. On the other issue, the twin issue of availability, we made one hell of a mistake with Lego. It was an Australian film. We financed it together with Warner Brothers. It was made here in King's Cross in Australia. Because it was so important, we held it for a holiday period. It was a disaster. It caused it to be pirated very widely. And as a consequence, no more. Our policy go forward is that all of our movies will release day and date with the United States. I see Mark Woodruff from 20th Century Fox. We were chatting on the phone yesterday. Mark is pursuing a similar course. I know Paramount are, Universal are. So movies will come out at the same time. The other important dimension of this is that there has to be a theatrical window so that the business model can work so that movies can get made. Without that window, there would be no feature movies, there would be no theatres. And it's really very simple. Records and music cost somewhere from $30,000 to $300,000 to produce. To make a feature film is anywhere from $5 million, $8 million, $100 million, $200 million. And you need a window for the business model to work. And those that say solve the problem by putting the movies out on digital download at the same time as the theatres, because that's what music's done. Well, music is day and date, but the fact of the matter is pirating is still massive. I'm told there were 2.5 million downloads of music on just Pirate Bay in Australia. And as a consequence in music, there's not a record store left. It was my great Saturday morning joy. There's not a record store left anywhere in the suburbs of Melbourne that I'm aware of. And that will happen to Australian theatres. I grew up in Ararat, great cute town, but the one place that was exciting for families, kids to go to was the local theatre. The Parramatters, the Frankstons, the Liverpools. I think theatre's a very important part of our culture, not to mention the tens of thousands of people employed and the tens of thousands of people employed in film production. That's why we need a window. But bottom line, we are striving to make it cheaper, affordable and available as early as practical. In fact, the same as the United States and the rest of the world.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Thank you. Richard, Foxtel made a big announcement a few days ago. Tell me how, without repeating exactly what Graham said, but I mean, what's your reaction to Graham's observations? What's your business doing? You're the biggest pay TV platform in Australia by a long stretch. What are you doing to make your content more available and affordable?
Look, like Graham, we think there are many things. We've all got a role to play in this.
I might come and sit down.
Clearly, education is an important part. Clearly, having a legislative framework is important, but clearly the content owners and people like us do have a role to play in making sure our content is accessible and available. So for a long time now, we've been doing direct from the US and bringing shows in within 2 hours of their screening in the US and all the big dramas, the HBO dramas. We've done that with Game of Thrones, Boardwalk Empire and so on. We've recently announced a couple of things. One, we launched our movie subscription video on demand service Presto back in March. We announced about a month ago that we're halving the price of that, so that's now available for $9.99 per month for movies as they come into the subscription TV window and for a library of movies. And then just last week we announced that we're going to radically change our pricing for our main Foxtel service. So our entry-level pack will go from $49 to $25, and sport goes from $74 to $50, movies from $74 to $45, drama and so on. But I think it's important to note that it's important that content owners do this and respond to the market and respond to consumers, but that's not enough. And I think a good example is, if you look now in the US, Orange is the New Black is, I think, one of the most, probably the third most illegally downloaded show in the US at the moment. And that's a Netflix show that's available for $9.99 as part of a very cheap subscription, and still incredibly badly illegally downloaded. So we have a role to play, but there's much more that needs to be done to actually solve this. And Brett, I know, in the music world has examples of how that the accessibility and the pricing hasn't solved the problem.
Brett, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think Graham is right when he says the experience of the music industry is hugely instructive. Music industry was the first industry impacted by the digital tsunami, not just the first content industry, the first industry. It began to be heavily impacted in the late 90s. It's now been 15 years since Napster. So it's been subjected to a continuous process of transformation over that 15 years. It's undertaken the transformation from a physical business to a digital business, and now it's in the second phase of transforming from a digital ownership model to a digital access model. Position in Australia right now is that there are about 30 licensed music digital services. We have all of the key fully interactive streaming services. We have all of the principal semi-interactive streaming services, and we of course have the digital download services. To take two examples of Spotify and Rdio, you can for around $12 a month now get access to 24 million tracks or 30 million tracks. So far as the user is concerned, the experience is pretty much the same as the ownership model. So whereas a generation ago it might have cost you $20 to buy an album, it's now $10 to $12 a month to have access to this unprecedented number of tracks. In the physical world, you had access to about 40,000 tracks at any given time. Now you have access to these 30 million tracks. $12 a month. And yet, the problem of piracy in Australia is pretty much as big as it's been in over the past 10 years. By our best estimate, there are about 2.5 to 3 million people currently accessing on a regular or semi-regular basis legal download or streaming services. And there are about 3 to 3.5 million people who are accessing illegal services, either streaming sites or torrent sites, regularly or semi-regularly, i.e. at least once a month. So despite this extraordinary availability, at a price equivalent, I must say, and the game has moved on since the IT pricing inquiry, which focused on the comparative prices of downloads. The game has moved well and truly on. The real game is now the streaming access model. People from Spotify here, it's $12 a month. That's about what you pay in America. I think it's $10 a month in America. In the UK, it's £10 a month. In Europe, it's €10 a month. So price is very equivalent.
Brett, thanks for that. Just, you mentioned Spotify. Will Page, who is the Scottish, I hope you've already voted in the independence referendum, but Will Page is a Scottish economist, and he is the chief economist from Spotify, and he's in Australia. Can you tell us what your research on music piracy has revealed and its relationship to Spotify?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. It's great to be here. I have to say, on a personal note, for 20 years I've wanted to visit Australia and follow in the footsteps of my ancestors, who are innocent, by the way.
Yeah, they all say that.
I'm actually looking for a QC to do the retrial. Do you know a good QC? But also, on a more important note, for 8 years of my professional career, I've worked on the Digital Economy Act. So this has been an eye-opening experience coming to Australia. I want to be there to help you and the audience and the stakeholders on the stage to learn what worked and what didn't work in the UK experience. With Spotify, just a very quick outline of where we are in Australia. We've talked about people, product, and price on stage. I think something has to be said for Spotify. We know that 1 in 6 Australians have Spotify, which is quite an incredible achievement for the company. We also know that 3/4 of our user base in Australia are under the age of 34, and that's really important. If you think about a 34-year-old, I used to be that, if you think about a 34-year-old, they've lived through a decade and a half of digital disruption. They may not have known anything different since Napster, so we are penetrating that younger age group who wouldn't have any concept of ownership. And thirdly, we know that the growth in streaming in the Australian music industry last year was completely dominated by Spotify. The vast majority of the growth in streaming revenues to labels came from Spotify as well. And that does come down to people. Kate Vale and her team have achieved amazing things with limited resources. It comes down to price, to echo what Brett said. This time, a music service has come in at the right price for Australia. It comes down to product as well. I don't know if you know this, but the play button on Spotify, Malcolm, starts 285 milliseconds after you press play. Now, you're considered to be one of the brightest brains in Australia. Do you know why it starts 285 milliseconds?
That's very kind of you, and the answer is no.
Because that's the time to which the human brain can't spot delay.
Right.
And that's what you learn when you work with engineers. Now, the point being, it's a lot faster to get content from Spotify than it is to get it from BitTorrent, especially when it's 285 milliseconds. You can't spot the delay. So what have we done? We're here for Big Sound, which is tomorrow in Brisbane. And we've done a big piece of work looking at piracy, and I really want to help inform the debate. We've noticed that Spotify is making inroads into piracy, a 20% drop in the piracy volume over the period of a year, which is interesting.
In which markets, Will?
And this is purely on Australia.
Right.
But the really interesting thing is when you look at piracy levels for music, TV, and film, and this is what I found staggering. You would see that the piracy levels in Australia for TV and film are 4 times that of music each. So TV is 4 times the size of music, and film is 4 times the size of music. And this was during a time period which didn't even include Game of Thrones. So that was quite remarkable as well. One thing on that, which I found really interesting, which was that TV piracy peaked between Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and film piracy peaked Friday, Saturday, which is essentially consumer behavior. You watch a bit of TV at the start of the week, you might watch a movie at the weekend. And that helps reiterate the point about supply dictates demand. Last comment from me is, I think the biggest challenge that you face here in Australia, from what I've learned in the past 2 days, is inertia. You've been stuck with this problem for a long time. And that's that change of consumer behavior which will be the biggest challenge that you face. But following your debate here, I think you're on the right track. One very final comment. Peter discussed Spain. Spanish in-laws. I spend a lot of time in Spain, and I think you'll find it quite funny that in Spain they call copyright the right to copy.
Okay, thank you. Now, Alan Kirkland from Choice, you've been in your submission, and by the way, this is you can read all of these submissions and a lot more on this on the Attorney General's website. I should say, by the way, the Attorney General George Brandis sends his apologies. He has an important cabinet committee meeting in Canberra tonight and can't be with us, but nonetheless, all those submissions are there. Now, Alan, just tell us what's the choice, the consumer perspective. I mean, do you buy what these guys are saying, that content is getting cheaper and therefore there's no justification for illegal downloading?
No. To some extent, yes. I mean, we've obviously seen prices of some forms of content drop in the last few years, and we really welcome that. But there's still an enormous price gap, particularly for the really popular TV shows and movies, compared to what people pay in the US. And to some extent, that's a reflection of a historical problem that we've just paid a lot more in Australia for a whole bunch of things for many years, and it's now, with the internet, that's really obvious. So it is partly about price. It's also partly about availability, and I think that's the area where the industry has actually come further. I think that there are many examples of the release windows shortening. The ABC's been fantastic about that too, with shows like Doctor Who. But we've still got this problem around price and availability, and until we grapple with that, then we're not really going to be able to grapple with these problems. I mean, today in the lead up to this forum, there's been a lot of discussion about these issues. I've been on Talkback Radio, taking calls. I've been watching the debate online, and there are very few people who say that there should be a right to piracy. Virtually nobody is out there saying that. I think consumers get that it costs money to create the content that they love to watch, and I think Australians feel a great affinity with our creative communities and want to see them thrive. But we need to address those root causes around price and availability if we want to give our creative industry a really strong and vibrant future. It needs to be an industry that lives...
It's a bit of a Freudian slip.
It already
there,
has
All right, well, look, I think that's enough for you for the moment. Poor old Duncan here, I mean, seriously, he's... Look at those. Look, I mean, really, he'll be sleeping out with Cleaver before long, at this rate. Now let's move on to the next slide. I want to move on to this is the question. We know we've got a problem. We've talked about affordability and availability. What reasonable steps can the ISPs take? Now, Overseas, a number of countries have had what is sometimes called a graduated response scheme or a notice scheme. And basically what that, and this is really only relevant, and the more technical people than me can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is really only relevant to peer-to-peer file sharing, where you can identify the customer IP address or the IP address of the computer that is sharing or using, distributing infringing content. And what the in the countries where these schemes exist, and the United States, UK and New Zealand are three good examples, the ISP can be required to, in effect, write a letter to the person, send a message to the customer who had the infringing IP address, and those letters can go up in increasing tones of severity or sternness. In the UK, at the end of it, there doesn't seem to be any sanction. In the US, there is the potential for the ISP, if you're a recidivist illegal downloader, to have your service slowed or even cut off. In New Zealand, there is a mechanism which the movie industry, certainly Graham's industry, is not a fan of, where the ISP will say, okay, we've sent 3 messages to this account holder. He or she is still nicking your product. Here's his address, here's his name, you sue him. And they can bring a claim in a small, in effect in a small claims court. Now, I'd have to say there is mixed evidence. It's contentious as to whether any of these schemes work and how well they work. And I just want to now go to Jane Van Beelen from Telstra and David Buckingham from IONET. Now, David and Jane, your 2 companies' submissions both agree that ISPs can play a role in reducing copyright infringement, but you differ very markedly in your approach. Jane, can you explain what you think, what Telstra's point of view is on this? And then perhaps we'll go to how you differ, David.
Sure, Malcolm. And David, though he sends his apologies, he would love to be here. But basically, as you will have read, David is very passionate that online piracy is wrong. And he is also passionate that we as an industry, as ISPs, can do something more to assist in dealing with this issue. And we do know that people can get frustrated with the availability issues, but that is no excuse, we would say, for piracy. But equally important to Telstra is the interests of our customers. And we think that when we play a role in trying to address online piracy, our customers' rights and their expectations of us, their expectations of privacy, also need to be protected and respected. And so for us, that means that we shouldn't have to enforce the rights of others against our customers without some form of judicial oversight. Our customers wouldn't want us looking at what they're doing online. Rather, we would want an independent third party to indicate to us, where there is a site which should be blocked or infringing activity taking place.
Jane, just stopping there. Graham has argued, I'm using Graham as the leader of the content side, but Graham has argued, he's not arguing that you should be obliged to terminate people's internet access, as some people have argued in the past. But he argues that you should, if somebody is still illegally downloading after 3 notices and they don't provide any explanation, that you should actually slow down the speed of their access. Now, you've said that raises very big issues because, it could be an office, it could be a household, it could be innocent parties affected, and of course there are applications, vital applications, that may not then be able to be, used. So just enlarge a bit on that as to why you don't feel you should be applying the stick to the infringing customer.
Sure. Just to be clear, we support the idea of a notice scheme, and we would want that to apply to all ISPs, and we would want this sort of judicial oversight of any sanction because at the end of the day, it's not for us to be overseeing what our customers do with their internet access. I don't think customers want their ISP to have that role.
So would you prefer a model like New Zealand then, if there was to be a sanction at the end and be imposed by a court?
We think so. I mean, we would want it to be some kind of expedited process. We're not about making this hard, but we would want there to be some expedited access to a court where, frankly, those who allege infringement would have to put their case and that people would have the opportunity to defend themselves.
Okay, thanks. Jane, David, you're the number 1 ISP, number 3 ISP, or maybe number 2 ISP.
For DSL.
For DS, okay, doesn't matter. Anyhow, you've got a big business, and congratulations the way you've grown it. Doesn't matter. You're doing very well. You're doing very well. Just keep spending money with the NBN code, that's all I say. Tell me...
The quicker you give it to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Good on you. Don't worry. We can't wait to get it to you. Now, returning to copyright, you've got a different approach to Telstra to this, and just explain, your perspective.
Sure. Well, firstly, we have the same approach in that we want to see the problem resolved. So don't kid yourselves that we don't want that to happen. We do. And we have huge responsibility in that issue ourselves, and we recognise that. I guess where we differ is how you do it. And all the research that I've read that's been passed to me, that we've done, and remember we've been in this longer and deeper than most of the people here, apart from Graham possibly, points to notice schemes not working. And I'm looking for an effective and efficient outcome that solves the problem and point to a notice scheme that's worked.
Yeah, well, Graham, let's hear. So the question is, do the international schemes work? And Graham, and then I know that Ishtar from Google's got something to say about this too.
Okay, I'd love to jump in and say there is a scheme that's working in the Republic of South Korea. The reason why Korea is so significant is it was the first country to get high-speed broadband. And the commercial entities that all hated one another, they worked together, the ISPs worked, the government worked together, and they did 3 things. Cheaper movies available online, 10 new services started, an education program, and the graduated response, and in their case, it was a 29-day suspension. It's knocked piracy out. The figures are dramatic and proof. So whoever's advising you, David, I'd love to sit down with you and walk you through all this. We used to own the biggest theatre circuit in Korea. I have an intimate knowledge of it. But the stats are undeniable and powerful. Now, the difference is in Australia, we're saying slow the speed or shaping. And I don't get why it's seen as so draconian, because my wife is a customer of yours, David, and she has her speed slowed regularly by you because she exceeds her plan. I wish you'd shut her off. And you'll do that if she doesn't pay.
Can I just say something there? I think it's important to recognise that there's no silver bullet here. If this were easy to solve, it would have been solved. But, there are a range of options. All of them will probably be effective to some extent. Certainly we saw in France as another example of a notice scheme. 90% of the people who got notices didn't need a second notice. So if you're talking a 3 notices regime, you've knocked out 90% of it with the first notice. And in fact, the number of customers that had to have enforcement taken against them was minuscule by comparison to the numbers of notices sent, as first notices. So if you're trying to reduce the size of the problem and then, perhaps only have to enforce in a small number of cases, as part of a multi-pronged approach, I think you have to look at this option.
I think though we need to, sorry if I can jump in. I mean, the evidence, the supposed evidence there is heavily contested, and to the extent there's anything published in a peer-reviewed journal that says there's no evidence that would justify a claim that those schemes have been effective. It's a bit of a game, I think, of sort of, rent a consultant and you can get somebody who'll write a report that says what you want it to say. And I don't think the test should be here that we do something because maybe it will work. If we're going to do something that's highly intrusive, adds costs to business, will pass on costs to consumers, and add risks to consumers in terms of a slower or cut-off service, then there needs to be a very strong rationale for it, and that's simply not here with any of the options that are being discussed.
Okay, can I just ask, is Ishtar... Yeah. This is Ishtar Vij from Google. You've got a big stake in this industry, a global the biggest global business of them all. So what do you say? What do you say has worked?
Yeah, look, no, I appreciate the opportunity to make a couple of comments, and we certainly have experience with this issue right across the globe. And I think it is important, you know, online piracy is an important issue. It's also important to put it in the context of what the internet has done for creativity and for creators. It's actually been a boon to creativity. There are fantastic new made-for-web content getting out there. Look at Mighty Car Mods, look at Bondi Hipsters. There's also great new business models. We've heard briefly from Spotify. We see Netflix in the US and what it's achieving. YouTube, for example, has paid over $1 billion to the music industry over the last 5 years. And if we take Tennis Australia as an example, for the Open this year, they actually were using YouTube to monetise user uploads on YouTube, and they were able to monetise 30 million uploads, and that's just this year. So there's a huge amount of potential there. The one thing that we do believe as Google, and this is very important, is that content owners do need to be able to control their content online, but it can't be done in a way that compromises the broader ecosystem. And our view is that the current proposals threaten the creation of and access to new business models in Australia. And this is where I draw out a real disconnect, actually, between the public debate and what is being put in the discussion paper. The public debate here, it talks about notice schemes. What's in the discussion paper isn't notice schemes. It's about extending authorisation liability to all players. The authorisation liability provision is a technology neutral provision. It's not something that will just apply to the ISPs. It will apply to schools, to universities, to libraries, to all cloud providers, and certainly we have a big stake in that debate. So we have a great concern from that point of view. Rather than put at risk the exact services that can be part of the solution to this problem, we want to focus on things that work. And in terms of things that work, to your question, we've seen a great lot of success around the globe with Follow the Money, and I know that the industry here has expressed interest in pursuing following the money, and that's about cutting off the economic incentives for the true rogue operators, so for the Pirate Bays of the world. And that is actually going to be a far more effective solution to the problem, in our opinion. We're also just seeing, you know, in a lot of ways, the pricing and availability elements are just getting going, and we need an opportunity for that to have a go, and for the impact of that to be seen. There is a long way to go on this, and particularly in the context of wanting to make sure that we have solutions that work before we jump into legislation, we would really encourage an approach that looks at follow the money and allows those types of industry negotiated solutions before jumping into legislation that throws out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Can I just comment on that? I mean, follow the money is potentially one part of one solution for one of the problems. That can go some way to addressing pirate sites. But there's a much simpler way to address pirate sites and just shut them down. And there's a very simple way which has been proposed in the paper to do that, where the content owners have to go to a court, so there is judicial oversight, get an order and ask the ISPs to shut down sites. And that will be effective. It's been seen to be effective overseas. Another site might open up, you shut that site down. This will stop a lot of it. But to your other point, if we sit and wait and we don't introduce some schemes soon, there won't be an industry. The business model for creating expensive movies and expensive TV is much more complex than you just described. It is really expensive, and if there aren't models that can actually make that work, and if we're relying on advertiser-supported YouTube to support the content industry, it's going to be a very, very, very different type of content, different types of TV shows, different types of movies that we're going to have in the future than we have today. We'll have a lot more cats on skateboards. We'll have a lot less Game of Thrones.
Right, well, just hang on. Yeah, Brett, and then I want to move. We've got to keep cranking along, but very quickly.
I don't want to respond to a polemic with a polemic, but I do want to say that what the nation should enact should be a true reflection of the nation's value system, not a reflection of the private interests of perhaps the most powerful corporation on the planet. I have seen, we pay 25,000 writers every quarter their income. I have seen, over a period of the last 10 years, a decimation in the incomes of writers. Of course it's true that the internet is a wonderful thing. Of course it's true that the internet has opened up all sorts of creative opportunities for artists of all kinds. However, what the government is proposing is firstly a proposal with respect to the existence and accessibility to pirate businesses that is in place throughout most countries throughout the European Union. Nothing unusual. Nothing has disturbed the creativity in a country like France or the UK. Creative industries in those countries are flourishing. And secondly, there's an attempt to address at an administrative, non-heavy-handed, non-litigious level consumer behaviour. And what's happened in the past 15 years, post-Napster, is that an entire generation have gotten into the habit of believing that the content is free. If I want it now, if I want it for free, I can get it. And all this proposal attempts to do is to get the parties back to the table to negotiate a reasonable scheme. And of course, if I read the Comms Alliance submission and indeed the Telstra submission, they're very, very close to being in agreement with us. They're really only issues about sharing costs. So
Well, let's
I'm sorry
move
for
on.
the
Let's
polemic.
move on to that. Can we get the next slide? Okay, the next one. Now we're still talking about the notice schemes. We're not talking about injunctive relief. Fruity jumped ahead of us then, but so the cost of sending out these notices, assuming we were to go down that route, and that is a widely deployed approach. Who is going to pay the costs? There are different examples around the world. In New Zealand, the cost is paid entirely by the rights owners. The government there took the view that it was their content, it was their financial interest that was being protected, so they should pay the cost. The ISPs say that the cost, which is $25 a notice, is a fraction of what it really costs them. Graham thinks it's a vast, profitable profit centre, and it doesn't work anyway. In the United States, it is shared. In the UK, it's shared 75 to the rights owners, 25 to the ISPs. So I want to say, go to you, Richard. But let me put it straight up to you. You say you're losing a fortune out of this. The absolute economic viability of your business is threatened by this piracy. You say that a notice scheme is going to reduce that. It obviously has a cost. Why shouldn't you pay all of the cost of that, as Telstra and IONET and the Comms Alliance and others argue?
Well, there's three buckets of costs we're talking about, Malcolm. The first is the cost of detecting the IP addresses that are illegally downloading content. And that's something that content owners take on. That's a cost we bear. There's then the cost of setting up whatever systems you need to send these notices. Yeah. And that there may be some upfront costs in that, although ISPs send notices to their customers the whole time. But we're certainly willing to contribute if there are any additional upfront costs. We think that's a reasonable thing to contribute to. There's then the third cost, which is actually pressing the button, sending the notice. And our position is that each party should bear their own costs. We should bear the costs of finding the illegal downloaders, but the actual implementation costs should be borne by the ISPs. And the reason for that is we want this to be as efficient as possible. We want the ISPs to do this as efficiently as possible. As I said, we'll contribute to any upfront costs that need to. Because if we don't have that, and there's not an incentive for ISPs to be efficient, then recalcitrant ISPs will find a way to make this expensive and make it slow and make it difficult and defeat the scheme. And by each party bearing their own costs, which has worked in other jurisdictions, we think that's the most...
Which jurisdiction has it worked?
It's working very well in the US at the moment. It's working well in Ireland and the UK. It's a number of jurisdictions. It's only really New Zealand where it's not working is where they've gone the other way.
Okay.
So this needs to be efficient, and we need each party to bear their own costs. We don't think, once you've got the upfront setup costs, the cost of pressing a button and sending a notice, which ISPs do to their customers the whole time, shouldn't be very much.
Well, you run a very big ISP, David. What do you say about that?
I'd point Richard to the 59 footnotes in our submission where we've researched all of the schemes, and Rebecca's sat right there in front of me, and she's provided a huge amount of research, and there are many, many countries where the schemes don't work.
But what about the cost, though? I mean, what about you say, I put the question straight to Richard, But why do you say, leaving aside whether the scheme will work, and we'll get Rebecca to make a contribution on that. You've pointed, this is Rebecca Giblin, who's a academic and writer in this area, an expert in this area. But why should you not be able to contribute anything to it?
Why should we contribute to a scheme that we think is ineffective?
Okay, so but if it was effective, all right. No, but this is a good point. So is your objection to paying that you don't want to pay for something that is effective, that is not effective, I should say, or is it that you don't want to pay for something that might be effective but in any event is protecting somebody else's financial interests and therefore they should bear the cost of that protection?
It's both.
It's both. Okay.
So Malcolm, if something's stolen out of a shop,
Yeah.
doesn't the government normally the one that actually takes some action there through the police? So why are you signalling out copyright owners?
So do you think the government should be paying to
No, I
do
think
this?
you should do it the most efficient way possible.
No, but you said the police.
Well,
which
I don't think you should single out the owners of the
Joe
the
Hockey
copyright.
will just. He'd be so thrilled to pick up the tab here.
But
I mean, he'll be there. He is. He's coming. He's running down the stairs. You know?
Can I make a powerful point that
Yeah.
will greatly please Joe Hockey? Right now you have a situation where tax-paying companies are being badly hurt, individuals are losing their jobs, and it will accelerate and get worse. We're talking about all the theatres of Australia, we're talking about free TV, pay TV, on, sporting bodies, etc. Malcolm, I think that this can be a profit centre for Joe by investing a little in helping to... But for starters, Village Roadshow will step up, we will put up the max because it's the right thing to do.
Well,
and I would say to you, David, put some back. You know, I looked at your published accounts. You've built a fantastic company at IONet. You're making 197 EBITDA. The whole film industry is only the size of your company. Put a little back. It's not a lot of money. We'll put our share. We'll put even more of our share. This is good for Australia.
There you go. I don't know what's more remarkable, the compassionate generosity of the panel or the concern to make my friend Joe happy. It's amazing. But Jane, you wanted to make a comment on this.
Well, I guess I just wanted to say that I think the incentives must be there to minimise the costs no matter who pays. I mean, at the end of the day, we want a scheme that is as efficient as possible. I don't think you need to lump all the costs onto the ISPs to achieve that. But coming back to
you just pass the costs on to your customers, though.
Well, that
you?
is the problem,
Yeah,
is surely not, that the customers are then bearing, law-abiding customers are bearing these costs. But I mean, I go back to the shop analogy. If I've got a warehouse or a shop, that's my property, and I pay the security guard to guard it. So I take responsibility for protecting my property right, and that's what this is. It's an intellectual property right, copyright, and as the rights owners are the beneficiaries of the revenues they earn for exploiting that right, and really we would say that they therefore should bear the costs, making sure that they're as efficiently incurred as possible of protecting that right.
if you want to keep going with that analogy, I mean, Westfield has a whole bunch of shops. They probably employ a security guard because that's the most efficient way to stop people stealing. So if you can do it very efficiently, why isn't that a good thing as well?
Well, we would of course endeavour to do anything
She
efficiently.
says it's their shop. It's their shop.
But if someone takes something out of David Jones and the Westfield security guy sees it happening, he's not going to just let it happen because it's not his shop.
Does David Jones pay Westfield rent? I think they probably do.
Probably. And that's where, but
I think
ISPs make a lot of
nexus.
money. ISPs make a lot of money by content.
But the point is we're not watching what our customers are doing.
A couple of quick questions. Number one, the governments in the UK and France make a huge contribution to the scheme. In France, it's paid for by the government. In the UK, my understanding is they're putting in £1.3 million into the educational part of the scheme. So, but thirdly, the big answer surely is that the ISPs are the parties who, at the end of the day, have made the money from the traffic. The content owners make nothing from the traffic.
But the content owners are losing money from the traffic. But look,
what the artists want to see is the ISP industry acknowledge that they have a stake in the game, that they have some corporate responsibility. That's all this is.
Well, great. Now listen, I'm very concerned to move on because we're running out of time. I want to move on to slide 6, which is the issue of extended injunctive relief. The reason for that is I'm worried that consensus is going to break out here, and they're all going to resolve that the government will have to pay for it. So, and that I could just see that trend, that where that's trending. So that can't happen. Now, we've been talking a lot about peer-to-peer file sharing, but what about sites which are either make it their business to promote access to illegally obtained content, or simply offer the ability to stream infringing content? Now, what we have seen in the UK and other jurisdictions is the ability for a rights owner to go to a court and get an injunction to have a site blocked. Now, we'll recognise that there are plenty, that new IP addresses will be deployed, new URLs, and there'll be workarounds. But there has been, this is my impression is that this is we'll find out in a minute, this is a less controversial area because it doesn't involve sending notices to people. And of course, you guys, the ISPs, you do get asked to block access to sites by the police and others from time to time, so it's not exactly a new approach. I just want, briefly, David and then Jane, what is the attitude of these two big ISPs here to the site blocking proposal? And then we might go to Alan Kirkland for a consumer view. So David, first to you.
I'm going to steal a good friend's comment in his submission, John Stanton. We could end up playing whack-a-mole.
Yep.
If we do this, and I can think of examples. I think Pirate Bay hid themselves for many, many months, and eventually, I think it was Sweden where they won the day and hiding themselves. So be aware that technology finds a way around those things and makes it very difficult to actually pin somebody down.
But in principle, I mean, and I know there are issues. Obviously, you don't want to be getting a injunction to block access to a perfectly legitimate site that has one, a photograph or a bit of video that's not licensed. There's a lot of, to pick a ruddism, a lot of specificity that's got to go around this, and design. But in principle, David, do you have an objection to, if you've got a site that is streaming illegally, Graham's content, Peter's, multiple episodes of Rake, it's being streamed, they're not paying him for it. Do you object to being asked to block access to that site?
I personally don't, and if I'm following a legal requirement to do so, I will.
Yeah, but I know obviously you'll obey the law, I understand that, but I mean, do you think would be a bad law if you were required to do that? If a court ordered you to do it?
I am worried about the ability for a law like that to be put in place. A, to have an effect, and B, to solve the problem, and C, where will the checks and balances come from? Something like that needs to be very, very carefully monitored. I can go back to countless examples of this in the past. Yep. Dare I mention filtering? Yep. There were real issues.
Yeah, no, we don't. Issues. I mean, Jane, are you in the same place that it's basically subject to getting the detail right, you don't have a problem with it?
Yeah, it's not something you do lightly, so there has to be good judicial oversight. And obviously it's not a silver bullet, but yes, we would support that. We would want it to be applied to all ISPs. We actually think that this is something that could be done relatively quickly. It's quite a small legislative change. It was done in Ireland, for example, and the idea is you'd want it to be a fairly expeditious process for the rights holders to actually, get that order and have it implemented. So,
and you'd have to get it quickly because obviously if it was the latest episode of, dare I say, Game of Thrones, the most quoted piece of content in the context of piracy ever, if you, 24, 48 hours after the episode, the interest is not going to be there, isn't it?
Exactly, and also to get the sites while they're active before they move.
Okay. Alan, what do you've basically argued in your submission that this is only going to these measures are only going to cause problems for the technically unsophisticated because people will use VPNs and other mechanisms to get around it, and it's not worthwhile. Is that the reason just to throw in the towel and not do anything?
The fundamental test is if we're going to do something, particularly if it involves legislation and government intervention, then it should be something that we're confident will work. There needs to be an evidence base for it. It's funny, I sometimes feel like we've fallen through the looking glass in this debate because as a consumer group, we're often out there saying to government, please legislate to fix this problem. And government says, no, that will add cost to industry. And in this debate, it's kind of flipped in that there's appetite to do something with a limited evidence base, and we're saying, hang on, let's hold back on it. I mean, if you look at site blocking, it is like whacking moles. Web developers, people who run websites, move much faster than courts. And if you look at the evidence from overseas, in other countries that have had these powers, in the UK, Game of Thrones, to use another Game of Thrones reference, Pirate Bay has been banned since 2012, and it didn't stop the UK from being the third in the top 3 countries of illegal downloaders of Game of Thrones.
Were they ahead of us?
I'm not sure on that point. But
it's always good to beat the Poms.
But Netherlands is a better example. They've actually had a ban on Pirate Bay for years, and a court recently threw it out because they said, look, it just hasn't worked. So the evidence is pretty clear. We should only do these things if they're going to work.
Well, I'd have to disagree. I mean, I think the evidence, there's a lot of evidence that shows that these have worked. You're right that more sites do come up, but if you keep knocking them down and you combine it with a notice graduated response to solve the peer-to-peer, then it will be effective. And if otherwise, you're going to do nothing. And
if you look at the 20 at most accessed illegal sites in Australia over the past 5 years, they're pretty much the same sites. These are not sites, they're pirate businesses. And what the artist wants to know is what conceivable reason from public policy would prevent you from simply saying to Australian consumers, sorry, you can't access that site. Because its whole business model is about ripping off artists.
I just wouldn't want to build expectations that's actually going to deal with the core problem, which really comes back to those issues around availability and price.
But it might change behaviour. Might change. It won't solve the problem.
I think we need a stronger rationale
Hang
than
on,
mine.
David, the taciturn David Buckingham had something to say.
What will fix the core problem is if you take their money away and you follow their money and you starve them of funding, that'll fix the problem.
Yeah.
let's do both.
So, well, thank you, panel. Now, as usual, because I'm not doing a good enough job at managing this, we're running a bit late, but we've still got time for questions from the audience, and we may get some questions from online. But I can see Rebecca Giblin there, who's been mentioned in dispatches several times. So, Rebecca, do you want to make just a brief comment on what you've discovered, what your views are on the efficacy of international schemes? Because I know you've published a lot about it, and you can read more of Rebecca's work on the AG's consultations website.
So thanks very much, Minister. I think what's really important about tonight is that we've brought together such a range of people from what is a very polarised debate around the world and in Australia as well. And it's fantastic to have people representing the full gamut of views all in the same room, so we have an opportunity to hear each other's views and hopefully, instead of talking past each other, actually meet somewhere in the middle and understand the concerns of everybody. Now, I'm not here as somebody who is pro-graduated response or anti-graduated response. I'm here as somebody who is pro-evidence. And that's what I tried to do when I started looking at the various graduated response regimes that are operating around the world. I wanted to see which ones are working better, which ones are working worse, and how good a job they were doing at achieving the various aims of copyright law. Of course, with copyright law, we try and achieve a whole bunch of different things. Maybe we want to reduce infringement. Maybe we want to increase legitimate markets. Maybe we want to increase or make the most widespread possible dissemination of cultural content. So I looked at all of the evidence that was available in each jurisdiction that has graduated response, and I asked, well, to what extent are each of those achieving each of these aims? What I was really surprised to discover was that there's remarkably little evidence, scientifically credible evidence, that any of these different graduated responses are doing anything to achieve their aims. And so I've been listening to the panel tonight, and I think the panel genuinely believes what they're saying, but the insights that I've got from looking at the research does cast doubt on some of those claims. So, for example, we've heard about the notice volume data, for example, in France, and I think it was Jane who suggested 90% of people who get a first notice don't get a second notice, and suggesting that that's proof that it's working. So that sounds really good when you first listen to it, but I had a look at the numbers. And Hadopi is the administrative agency in France that's tasked with actually administering this scheme. And from the data that I was able to find, it looks like Hadopi has been inundated with tens of millions of infringement allegations. And they have resources to deal with only a few of them. The French government has funded them to the tune of tens of millions of euros, but the agency still is not able to respond to all of these allegations. So from the information that is publicly available, it looks like you've got maybe a 12% chance of actually receiving a notice if an allegation has been made against you in the first place. And so when I started thinking about that, and then looking at the discrepancy between the number of first notices received and the number of second notices received, I started thinking, well, if you've only got a 12% chance of receiving the first notice, then you've only really got, these are independent events, so you've only got a 12% chance of receiving a second notice. I know a lot of us in this room are lawyers, so we did this so we didn't have to do maths, but it's 12 to the power of 2. That's a very, very small chance that you're going to receive a second notice anyway. Now, that's leaving aside the fact that, of course, you have to get a first notice before you can get a second notice, so of course there are already going to be more first notices. If they started issuing second notices first, we'd really have a problem. So when you take all of this together, I've done all of the mathematical modelling in the paper, you can have a look at it. Actually, on the information that's publicly available, that notice volume data, if anything, suggests that there's more infringement after the introduction of Hadopi than before. So just simply looking at the notice, it's saying, well, there's less second notices than first notices. That's the kind of evidence that's being used, suggesting that graduated responses are working. But in fact, that doesn't tell us anything at all. The other kinds of evidence that is provided or has been provided in the past in favour of graduated response are things like studies that are being provided by right-holder lobbying organisations. There's studies that have been provided by the organisations that generate the infringement allegations, whose business model is to generate more allegations. These are studies that generally don't have publicly available methodologies.
So Jane, Rebecca, sorry, Rebecca, I beg your pardon. So basically, because we're running short of time, in a nutshell, what you're saying is that, it isn't proven that the notice schemes work. Is that right?
I'm saying I looked at every jurisdiction. I expected to find a lot more than I did. The evidence that I found was not scientifically credible.
And it's all in your...
It's all in the paper, which is freely available for
Good on you. Okay. Terrific. Well, Rebecca, thanks a lot for that. Now, are there some other questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Andrew Pam from Electronic Frontiers Australia. The Minister has said that he's interested in supporting innovative new business models, but I'm a little bit concerned that what I see here is mostly the representatives of existing large organisations and business models. I haven't heard anybody mention GOG.com, Humble Incorporated, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Pozible, or any of the other organisations that are in fact doing innovative new business models. For example, I use BitTorrent to receive documents and movies and video games that I have paid for and that are distributed legally over BitTorrent by these organisations. So I don't think it's safe to assume that BitTorrent is necessarily always illegal distribution.
No, I agree with that.
So I have some concerns about some of the premises that we've seen here tonight, and I think that we have to be very careful about how we exactly qualify these things before we move to act on them.
But can I just ask you this question? You talked about innovative new business models, and we're all in favour of them. But are those businesses so innovative that they can prosper without being paid?
Well, I have personally put money into a motion picture that has been funded to the tune of millions of dollars on Kickstarter, where the money has been obtained upfront from the audience before the film was even made. There's also a TV series being done under that model where they've asked for $500,000 to make a TV series in Japan. And again, the money is coming from the audience upfront. And at that point, if it gets copied afterwards, the money's already been paid to the artists.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And do we have another question? There's someone. Oh yes, yeah.
G'day, my name's Dave Robertson from the Binary Blatherings blog. My question is that despite all of these ideas being great ideas, it seems to me that the fundamental problem is one of data costs. Why are our data costs in Australia so expensive, particularly in the mobile world? For example, I'm with Telstra and I'm paying $135 a month to see 3 gigs of data on my phone. Furthermore, we pay more than any other country from everything from data to the humble ballpoint pen. Now, would it not be an idea that if the panel would like to see more streaming, perhaps we should look to the major telcos to drop their costs substantially to allow for streaming services to take off, as well as supporting other non-cable TV methods such as Netflix to allow licenses to them to allow for competition in the marketplace to drive prices down?
Anyone want to bite on that?
I would only say that, like our content investors, it also requires investment to run a network, and Australia's a huge country, and we invest in the highest of quality networks. I think you'll also find that if you look at some OECD statistics, Australia has one of the lowest mobile data rates in the OECD. We enjoy, outstanding quality mobile networks and among the lowest prices.
Okay. Do you want to add to that, David?
I can't wait for a better world of wholesale access and lower cost for customers.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to get your wholesale carrier built as cheaply as possible, as you've probably gathered. There is a connection.
I feel for you.
You do, yeah. Good.
No, him, not
Good.
you.
Yeah. Okay, now another question.
Hi, my name is Chris Marrick and I'm an independent film producer from Ozpix Entertainment. A film that we have copyright ownership in called Wolf Creek 2 has been pirated over 1 million times since its release earlier this year. My question to the panel is, if ISPs don't actively participate in anti-piracy measures, are they not seen by consumers as endorsing piracy and theft of product?
Well, David, what do you say to that? There's a film producer, she's worked hard, she's produced this movie, and it's being stolen.
We don't endorse it.
But what are you going to do to help her, though? That's the question.
We're doing lots to help. Firstly, we're making as much content as we can afford available to our customers through legal means. We've invested heavily in Fetch TV. We've got a free zone that we think's market leading. We encourage content buying on iTunes. We do a lot to educate our customers. And we are starving the BitTorrent sites of advertising revenue and whatever they need to survive. We're doing a lot.
Can I say, Malcolm, that as far as we're concerned in the industry, that perception is very alive. That the ISPs are almost willfully sitting on their hands.
You think they're heartless?
No, I'm saying there's a perception that they will let this argument persist as long as it needs to until a solution is imposed.
Very true. And I think the other issue is the only way to actually pirate a product is via an ISP. So what do you do?
Well, yeah, I think it's too late to stop the internet, I can tell you that. Now, do we have any other questions from the audience, or perhaps some from the audience this is being streamed to over the web? Do we have any? Someone up
yes.
Yes.
Social media, sort of mostly on Twitter. There's a lot of commentary around the discussion. People have been very interested. There have been 3 main streams of questions. Comments that BitTorrent should not be equated to copyright infringement, as per Andrew Pam's question. So there was a comment/question which runs, what about the films of recent time that have been released via torrents illegally by the makers of those films, music, etc.? They certainly do reach a wider audience for the makers and do help them get into the spotlight of filmmaking and music making, yes. So that was from Dave Brown. A question from Jason Cartwright was, are you going to shut down international sites, all that host torrents?
Okay, well they're both good questions. Perhaps one of the audience would like to answer this. How do you know whether traffic that's being shared via BitTorrent is infringing copyright or not?
Well, I personally don't know the technical way it's done, but there are people who are experts in this field who do trace it and can trace the way it trace the where the piece of content originated and work that out.
Okay, David, do you know how it's done? Oh, good. Thank heavens.
Oh, good.
Hi, I just thought, I'm not going to give a completely technical answer, but the evidence that is used in the monitoring of this is an equivalent to doing what is accepted in courts around the world, of getting the equivalent of working into a shop and getting a trap purchase when someone is selling an illegal piece of content. So nobody is monitoring the individual, but the traffic through the BitTorrent swarms that is offered through seeders and feeders is captured in a completely open and evidence way that has been accepted by courts. And that would be the basis of the packet material upon which a notice would be sent via an ISP for any one of these systems. And the material is captured in an evidence packet, which is available at any time. But the important piece of information is that the person who is using that IP address at that particular date and time is never known to the person who is obtaining that evidence. And that's why it's quite important through any of these systems and any of these schemes that we're trying to get people to bring to the table so that we can discuss them in a meaningful way once the law's changed, is that the ISP will be the only person who will ever know that consumer. They will never, their name will never be known to the person who wants an information notice to be sent to them to ask them to stop using BitTorrent to access the piece of music or the film that they are currently not paying for.
Yeah, I think well, thank you. Look, basically, the answer is that the rights owners use a product, typically something called DetectD or a variant thereof. They participate in the torrent swarm. So they therefore see the IP addresses of all the other computers that are sharing a particular piece of content. And as the lady who spoke earlier said, they therefore know those IP addresses. They're allocated dynamically by ISPs. So they're not like a phone number that you have all the time, and hence you need to get the record from the ISP. But the point that I was actually seeking to get earlier for the gentleman that asked the question is that it is possible to distinguish between traffic on BitTorrent that is legit and is not legit. Now, it's generally accepted in the industry that the vast proportion is infringing content, but it is also true that there is content that is shared and distributed that is lawfully done. So this is not anti-torrent. The content people are not anti-torrent at all. It's just that is a common mechanism for sharing infringing content, and it's one in which the IP addresses of the computers that are doing so is disclosed. Now, please.
Hello, Teresa Corbin from the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, ACAN. We're the communications peak body. I've got a question about the injunctive proposal. We've got concerns about the practical application of the injunction power. We've recently seen examples of websites being blocked that adversely affected many small businesses. And so what we'd like to see is not just an ability for a court to block a website based on the arguments of the aggrieved party, but also some kind of an opportunity for the other side, if there is one, to actually present a view, so that where there are cases where there are legitimate usages that have actually been blocked or potentially blocked as well, that there's an ability for what I believe, although I'm not a lawyer, is called amicus curiae. Is that pronounced correctly? I don't know. Anyway, I'm wondering what the panel would think.
Whoever said it first has been dead for a long time.
But basically for neutral parties or representatives, end users or small businesses or other parties that are affected by the injunction to actually present a view to the court before the injunction is granted. So I'm just wondering whether or not the panel has any views on that as a proposal.
Well, Brett, do you want to express an answer?
The proposal as framed is a very broad proposal. The main point about it is that it is subject to judicial oversight. It's about getting a court order. It's difficult to imagine an Australian court granting an injunction to block access to a particular site without giving the opportunity of either that site owner or the ISP or any other relevant party a right to be heard. And one would expect these orders, which will not be sought lightly by copyright. Nobody actually wants to go to court and spend the money. But it's very difficult to see anything other than normal, equitable principles applying to these applications. And of course, that can be handled in the drafting of the legislation.
Good. Okay, thank you. Now, are there any other questions? Yes. Oh, yes, Dr. Ergas here. Oh, Professor Ergas, I should say.
Thank you very much. My name is Henry Ergas. My question really is for the Minister, and my question is this. Minister, one of the, I think, excellent initiatives taken by your government has been to issue new guidelines for the review of proposed regulations. And those guidelines mandate a very thorough process of analysing and making public the analysis of the costs and benefits of proposed measures that would impose compliance burdens on industry and potential costs and benefits to the community. My question is this, do you intend to do such an analysis of the proposals contained in the discussion paper? And if so, how will it be done and when will it be made available?
Well, thank you very much. The proposals in the discussion paper are essentially they are a discussion paper. And, you know, for example, what has been canvassed in the discussion paper about authorisation liability, which is the law that essentially makes a person liable for the copyright infringement of another. Those changes have been, I have to say that there's been unanimity in that everybody has criticised them, found them inadequate from one level or another. So that's and that's what the whole purpose. This is an exercise in consultation. We're not drafting the law tonight, but the Attorney General, Senator Brandis, and I are very concerned to have the widest possible consultation. What we've sought to do is to go beyond just putting a whole bunch of submissions up on a government website, which is a useful measure, I might say. But I think this is another dimension, and I hope you found it useful. The answer is, Henry, that yes, we do. We certainly, that is part of the regulatory impact statement process. It's very important that we have a good understanding of what the costs are, and that's where the industry's contribution is critical. We do need to know what they are. Can I Narita, are you about to ask a question? Okay. Look, there was just one issue that I thought we might be able to say a little bit, just draw people out a little bit further on this, and it is this question of authorisation liability. A number of parties, Telstra and others, and IONET for that matter, have raised the prospect that the changes to authorisation liability canvassed in the government's discussion paper would impact on a whole range of third parties, libraries, Wi-Fi operators, the free Wi-Fi in a restaurant or in a council gardens or whatever. It would have a massive range of unintended consequences. That has been the thesis. And I thought that would be worth asking Jane to just flesh that out, and there may be some other comments on that, because clearly the rights owners, the copyright owners here aren't interested in pursuing universities and libraries and coffee shops. They're focused very much on the telco sector. So Jane, just want to let us know what you say about that.
We agree that is a concern. I mean, we see these amendments as potentially imposing on a wide range of bodies that do enable access to the internet, effectively an obligation to police what their customers are doing online. We think that's inappropriate. We think that all of the potentially captured bodies would, be extremely concerned about that. We also think that taking the approach of trying to address this by amending authorisation liability is simply not necessary and not helpful. So no other jurisdiction around the world has changed their authorisation liability to address this issue. We don't think it's helpful because we're here having a debate effectively about what measures would be reasonable and appropriate. If you change the law, you're going to end up having more and more debates like that in courts. What we would suggest is that the parties, as we've all shown a willingness to do, actually have more discussions about what a sensible and proportionate response to this issue would look like, and how these issues, can perhaps be navigated, and probably a multi-pronged solution developed. And then if legislation is necessary to implement that, then that is the legislation that should be pursued. We don't think that authorisation liability changes are going to create the environment in which the parties can actually seek that resolution.
So you would favour as I understand from your submission, I encourage everyone to read Jane's submission and all the submissions from the panellists, but your argument is, as I gather, there should be a much clearer, tighter targeted scheme that deals with the problem, which is internet service providers and telcos, and the ability to provide some form of notice to infringing customers, and also an ability to get injunctions to block infringing sites. And it should be clearly focused on that sector and not try to reach out into the rest of the rest of the community.
Well, I think there's certainly that risk of unintended consequences for the rest of the community.
Now, does anyone else want to have a comment on that? Oh, yes, please.
I did. Fiona Phillips from the Australian Copyright Council. I'm very pleased to hear from Jane about the goodwill and everybody wants to work together. But the reality is the Digital Agenda Act has been around for nearly 15 years now. The scheme always envisaged an industry code of conduct, and we're now nearly at the end of 2014 and no such scheme is in place. So I'm afraid I just don't have as much faith as you do that without some further move to create some new incentives that such a scheme is going to actually come into existence at all.
So you think without a legislative stick there will be no coming together, despite the bonhomie shown on the stage here?
Well, evidence would show to the contrary.
There you go. Very sad reflection on human nature. So, Brett.
I just want to say that it's important to understand what the true purpose of the authorisation device is. It is to bring, in the shadows of the IINet High Court decision, the ISPs back to the table. It's to recreate the incentive that the government thought it had created in 2005 to get the ISPs to cooperate with the content owners so as to reduce online infringement. Okay. That's the stated policy in the various free trade agreements, and that, of course, we say is that ought to be the policy based on principles of equity. And it's not about providing a platform to sue ISPs, it's about bringing them back to the table so we can have a code or an agreement.
Brett, the ISPs have been at the table, and as you said yourself, the key issue has been costs. So there's been no unwillingness to discuss. The whole industry has expressed that willingness to discuss and to engage. What we're concerned about is that this just tips it back such that what incentives do the rights holders have to agree that anything is reasonable if there's this huge stick of authorisation liability hanging over the ISPs?
Well, thank you. Now, it's 8 o'clock, and we said we would wrap up at 8 o'clock. So we've got two more. All right, we've got two more. I've been prevailed upon to run late, but there you go. Sir?
Rob Gibson. Just to throw a bit of a squib in at this late hour, why are we not talking, and I know why we're not, because certain stakeholders would be very unhappy about it, but why are we not talking about doing something as part of the solution, not the whole solution, but something that's analogous to what Cal did in the early 80s, which is to have a sort of an audit-based sampling scheme to work out what content's being copied, to have a royalty payment made by the people who are making the money out of that content being copied, which could then be distributed to rights holders as part of the solution. That would certainly be a kind of an incentive for the other actions to be accelerated to lower those royalty payments.
But how do you collect? I mean, if it's being, if a movie, if like the lady's movie she mentioned earlier has been, downloaded by 1 million people illegally, how are you going to collect it?
So you're collecting it via the ISPs, which is why I say it's going to be an unpopular idea.
Okay.
So you don't have to go to the sort. You don't have to go to the actual pirates. You're going to the ISPs. You're instituting a sort of a.
So you would have the ISPs pay not simply the cost of sending the notices, but pay an amount equal to the value of the content that is downloaded over their network.
Well, it's some royalty. It's some royalty that's calculated that's fair to all involved, and that incentivises the parties to work on the other angles as well.
Right. Well, I'm sure that'll find a lot of favour with Telstra and IONET. But now, sir, what was your?
Graham Phillipson, Comswire. Everybody here tonight has worked on the basis that piracy is a bad thing and that copyright's a good thing. There's a large and coherent and defensible body of thought that says that copyright's irrelevant in the digital age and that IP is an outdated concept, and that the way to solve these problems is to get rid of the whole concept of copyright entirely. But no one seems to address this.
But how do writers think?
It's a very long discussion, but are we not in the situation where none of this is going to work anyway? The technology always wins out, and we'll end up having the war on piracy being as effective as the war on drugs.
Well, on that, look, I think we have reached 8 o'clock. I think with Graham, Graham's argued that Graham Phillipson there has argued that presumably that Peter Duncan here can live on fresh air.
I don't need to live in.
He doesn't need to live. He'll go back to practising law. So look, thank you all. Yeah, Shakespeare didn't have copyright. That's right, but there wasn't the internet in Shakespeare's time either. And a few other things weren't there. So thank you all very much. Is there anything anyone panel would like to say in conclusion?
Yeah, I'd love to read something very brief that will go to Ishtar's discussion. And by the way, Ishtar, well done for taking down Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I hope that's the forerunner of being more proactive in dealing with these criminals. This is Steve Jobs. From the earliest days at Apple, I realised that we thrived when we created intellectual property. If people copied or stole our software, we'd be out of business. If we weren't protected, there'd be no incentive for us to make new software or product designs. If protection of intellectual property begins to dissipate, creative companies will disappear or not get started. But there's a simple reason: it's wrong to steal, it hurts other people's character, and it hurts your own character.
Good. Well, on that stirring moral exhortation from Graham Burke, I want to thank the panel very much for being here tonight, and thank you all for attending, and thank everybody that's been watching this over the web. Good. Thanks, guys.